Alright, so in our latest installment of Why the Fuck Do We Even Have a Supreme Court, our right-wing SCOTUS is coming down with a decision probably today on a case that is called West Virginia versus the EPA, which, if it is decided in the way that it appears like it's going to be, would basically eviscerate the capacity for the Environmental Protection Agency, or for members of Congress for that matter, to actually regulate things surrounding the environment and produce climate change actions. So, here from the New York Times, they say Republican drive to tilt courts against climate action reaches a crucial moment. So, a little bit of details here. They say, within days, the conservative majority on the Supreme Court is expected to hand down a decision that could severely limit the federal government's authority to reduce carbon dioxide from power plants, pollution that is dangerously heating up the planet. But that's only the start. They say the case, West Virginia versus the EPA, is the product of a coordinated multi-year strategy by Republican attorneys general, conservative legal activists and their funders, several with ties to the oil and coal industries, no surprises there, to use the judicial system to rewrite environmental law, weakening the executive branch's ability to tackle global warming. Not that President Joe Biden is even serious about addressing climate change in a real way, so, no real threat there, but still they're trying to undercut even future attempts at addressing climate change. But they continue here saying, coming up through the federal courts are more climate cases, some featuring novel legal arguments, each carefully selected for its potential to block the government's ability to regulate industries and businesses that produce greenhouse gases. Again, no surprises here. This is the entire conservative and even neoliberal ideology that has been baked within this country since basically the Ronald Reagan administration. But I mean, this is the goal. This has always been the goal, no matter which agency you're trying to talk about. They're going to do this under the guise of limiting bloated and bureaucratic government agencies. But really what they're trying to do is give even more power to the entirely tyrannical structure of the capitalist system, which is the exact same segment of our population that they serve. They serve the interests of capital, and so of course they're going to be prioritizing industry and business interests over actual environmental protections and really just the future sustainability of the planet at all. But they continue here saying the plaintiffs want to hem in what they call the administrative state. Again, there you go with the rhetoric. The EPA and other federal agencies that set the rules and regulations that affect the American economy. That should be the role of Congress, which is more accountable to voters, said Jeff Landry, the Louisiana Attorney General and one of the leaders of the Republican group bringing the lawsuits. So you understand exactly what he's saying here. Again, he's going to use this language about we're trying to reel in, bloated government agencies and government overreach, etc. That's not at all what this is about, okay? You can see it in the type of language that he's using here. He's trying to pretend as if the goal of this is to return this to the American people, right? Return this to a body in Congress that is more accountable to the voters. But the problem with this, which is the entire reason why we set up agencies like the EPA in the first place, is that members of Congress don't know what the fuck they're talking about when it comes to the actual science behind climate change. I mean, maybe you have a handful of them that are in there that actually do know the ins and outs of all of this, but the whole point of having an agency like the EPA that isn't, explicitly outlined with all of the specific details on all of the different pollutants and all of these different chemicals and everything within the environment, the whole reason you have the EPA in the first place is so you have a panel or a body of scientists, people who are doing the grunt work, going out, doing the tests, doing the, experiments and, running the type of scientific studies that determine exactly what is acceptable or what should be acceptable in terms of environmental protections that keep us all healthy and keep the planet sustainable. The whole point of having that as an agency is specifically because members of Congress cannot be reasonably expected to keep up with all of that science. They don't know what the fuck they're talking about, and so of course they're not going to be able to pass legislation on all of the different specific ins and outs of all of this in a reasonable way. And that's the entire point of this. It isn't to return the power to the American people, it is to return the power to the capitalist class and allow them to basically completely destroy the environment with no regulations or checks whatsoever from the government. But it's pretty transparent exactly what their goal is on this issue. But they continue saying that Congress has barely addressed the issue of climate change. Yeah, we got, motherfuckers like Joe Manchin, who is directly profiting from his dirty coal company in West Virginia, and he is blocking all climate legislation, which Joe Biden has absolutely no intention whatsoever on confronting him on that issue. But yeah, they've barely addressed the issue of climate change, but they say instead, for decades, it has delegated authority to the agencies because it lacks the expertise possessed by the specialists who write complicated rules and regulations and who can respond quickly to changing science, particularly when Capitol Hill is gridlocked. And they say West Virginia versus the EPA on the court docket is also notable for the tangible connections between the plaintiffs and the Supreme Court justices who will decide their case. And they say the Republican plaintiffs share many of the same donors behind the efforts to nominate and confirm 5 of the Republicans on the bench, John Roberts, Samuel Alito, Neil Gorsuch, Brett Kavanaugh, and Amy Coney Barrett. And they say the pattern is repeated in other climate cases filed by the Republican attorneys general and now advancing through the lower courts. The plaintiffs are supported by the same network of conservative donors who helped former President Donald Trump place more than 200 federal judges, many now in position to rule on the climate cases in the coming year. And they say at least 2 of the cases feature an unusual approach that demonstrates the aggressive nature of the legal campaign. In those suits, the plaintiffs are challenging regulations or policies that don't yet exist, so they're preparing for the future on this. They want to preempt efforts by President Biden to deliver on his promise to pivot the country away from fossil fuels, while at the same time aiming to prevent a future president from trying anything similar. And finally, we're going to finish off here with a little bit more details that I think are kind of important to include. They say victory for the plaintiffs in these cases would mean the federal government could not dramatically restrict tailpipe emissions because of vehicles' impact on climate, even though transportation is the country's largest source of greenhouse gases. The government also would not be able to force electric utilities to replace fossil fuel-fired power plants, the second largest source of planet-warming pollution. We already got number 1 and 2 there with wind and solar power. And the executive branch could not consider the economic costs of climate change when evaluating whether to approve a new oil pipeline or similar project or environmental rule. I mean, listen to what they're fucking saying here. The executive branch could not consider the economic, not even the economic costs. Okay, we're not even talking about like the environmental costs of new pipelines and projects like that. We're talking about the economic costs. And, you know, this is just a straight up fact. And this is why I think even, you know, conservatives would have an argument to support something like the Green New Deal, is because first and foremost, it's a jobs program on top of tackling climate change. And the reality of climate change is telling us that if you don't address it, if you just continue on this spiral that we are on right now, it's going to cost significantly more in environmental destruction and economic, supply chain breakdowns and mass migration, all these different other issues that are going to cost way more than investing in renewable energy, and way more than even, you know, the worst example of fear mongering on the Green New Deal would actually entail within the mind of a conservative. So even if you want to go with an economic argument, staying on the path that we are right now makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. But finally, they say those limitations on climate action in the United States, which has pumped more planet-warming gases into the atmosphere than any other nation, would quite likely doom the world's goal of cutting enough emissions to keep the planet from heating up more than an average of 1.5 degrees Celsius compared with the pre-industrial age. And that is a threshold beyond which scientists say the likelihood of catastrophic hurricanes, drought, heat waves, and wildfires significantly increases, and the Earth has already warmed an average of 1.1 degrees Celsius. But I think just to sum it up here, you have a good breakdown from Will Stansel, a good little tweet thread here on the current state of our Supreme Court and exactly what their agenda entails. So here's what he had to say. He said, the Supreme Court's legacy this term is forcing women to bear children, with the recent Roe decision forcing families to raise those children in a society awash with guns, talking about that recent Supreme Court decision, basically saying that it is unconstitutional for states like New York to put in place some regulations on who is able to purchase a firearm. But he said, and forcing those children to grow up in a world of runaway climate change. And he finished off here saying, what an utterly villainous institution, unleashing untold suffering on the future generations for no good reason other than the pursuit of their own poisonous social resentments. And it's not just the pursuit of their, own personal ideologies. It's the pursuit of the entire conservative project in this country, which is slashing the ability for the government to regulate the private sector and returning as much power as they physically can to the hands of the authoritarian capitalist class in this country. That is what all of these different decisions that we can talk about on, whether it's the EPA, whether it's the SEC ruling, whether it's, any of these other ones that you want to talk about, it all comes down to that same fundamental principle that conservatives, whether it's at the federal level in Congress, whether it's at the state level in these state legislatures all around the country, whether it's within the judicial branch all the way up to the Supreme Court, at every single level, this entire conservative project, which has been in the works for decades, if not centuries in this country, is one that seeks to put as much power into the hands of a tiny minority that sits at the top of our country, basically kings at this point, guys like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk and the rest of these executives and CEOs and billionaires in this country. They want to give as much power as physically possible to that capitalist class while destroying the ability for the government to reasonably put regulations in place that protect the health, the safety, the well-being, the future of the American people.